Welcome to this panel session where we will be spending the next 45 minutes or so discussing how the public sector is approaching the challenge of decarbonising their existing assets, managing future climate risks, and gearing up for the future as well. Now, the eagle-eyed among you may notice my background has changed. This is a pre-recorded session, so there won't be a live Q&A, I'm afraid, but you can, of course, still use the chat function to discuss this session's topic with other delegates and to share insights of your own. Now, it's often observed that government is construction's biggest client, so the strategies adopted by public sector bodies really do matter to the industry. So I'm delighted to be joined by three experts in the sector representing health, education, and the transport sector. Now, between them, I'm sure they can provide a fantastic snapshot of how things stand and where they are headed. So I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves now and to say a few words about their background. Fiona, if you wouldn't mind going first.
Thanks very much, Liam, and hi everybody. I'm Fiona Daly. I'm the National Sustainability and Workforce Lead at NHS England. I'm currently responsible for decarbonising the NHS estate and driving forward the accelerator programme we've got across health in that. Previously, I've worked in the NHS and in the private sector in the PFI industry, although hopefully you won't hold that against me.
Thanks very much, Fiona. We'll try not to. Herschel, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Thank you. Yes, I'm Herschel Patel. I'm the Head of Energy and Engineering at the Department for Education. I have also been in private sector, but not so much in PFI. And I'm responsible for decarbonising the estate, but also setting standards, engineering standards for school construction buildings. Thank you.
Great stuff. Thanks, Herschel. And James, finally.
Hi everybody, my name is James Greenway, Director of Estates, Facilities and Business Services at Highways England. I'm also responsible for our corporate carbon KPI, which is a big part of our path towards net zero. My previous career has largely been in the private sector, but also sort of a good 5 or 6 years now in the public sector side as well, with a lot of operational delivery units within the civil service.
Thanks very much, James. Herschel, perhaps you can start us off. I'm interested to know how your organisation goes about assessing the scale of the challenge that lies ahead of you. A lot of the buildings in your remit must be quite old, I would imagine. Do you have a good handle on what needs to be done across your estate, and how do you break down the path ahead from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, yes, the challenge is huge. I think we've got 23 odd thousand schools with about 63,000 blocks of schools, and that's just schools, not including FE and other education estates as well. You're right. There is through our CDC, our condition data collection, we've seen the condition of our estate. There is challenges around that and addressing those condition needs. I think it's also worth saying, where there are challenges, there are also great opportunities, particularly around sustainability and climate change. I think we've recognised through some of the work that we're doing that we can leverage off some of these things, try and promote better resilience to climate change, but also step towards zero carbon. I think as well, it's worth pointing out in terms of those challenges. I think we're moving into an era where health and well-being is becoming a bigger part of the journey, a bigger part of people's needs, and we're certainly seeing that in schools. And the pandemic has definitely highlighted the importance of health and well-being. I think sometimes we're finding that there are challenges between zero carbon and improving health and well-being, sort of having conflicting needs there. But also other things around the pandemic, such as improved ventilation, improved quality to reduce pathogen risks and COVID-19 risks in schools, has also sort of highlighted trying to find that balance between low carbon or climate resilience and addressing the right things in terms of well-being or pandemics. Is a huge challenge. But yeah, we're using data that we've collected over the last 5 years, and we're collecting a new round of data under condition data collection phase 2 to sort of assess the condition of our estate, but also then look at the opportunities that arise out of that.
Thanks, Herschel. James, from your perspective, I guess you have similar challenges but different kinds of assets from what Herschel's facing. But how are you assessing the scale of the challenge and trying to prioritise that, I guess?
Yeah, with an awful lot of help, really. So we've had sort of consultants help us formulate our plan. our portfolios span really diverse sort of uses, and it's usually the behaviours and the operations that go on in those buildings that really affect the carbon output. So for us, we've got sort of three main portfolios. The first one is the property we occupy, predominantly offices, things like that. We've got the operational portfolio, motorway maintenance compounds, traffic officer outstations. But we've also got a large portfolio of land that we hold for the network to either build roads at a later date or the physical highway presence themselves, which, as anybody who's travelled on our network will know, contain an awful lot of lights, gantries, and sort of messaging systems as well. So carbon for us is a really multifaceted picture. To put that all together into a sensible plan has not been the easiest thing, but we do have a really good data baseline now. We know where opportunities lie, and as Herschel says, there are things that sort of come out of the woodwork when you're doing this work that sort of are a pleasant surprise. So the fact that we hold an awful lot of woodland and sort of vegetation on our estates, really good for sequestration, but also lots of opportunities for things like solar farms, wind. So for us, there's no sort of there's no nose in any of this. It's all an opportunity, and very much using our land and buildings to make sure that we sort of work towards net zero with sort of quite challenging targets.
Thanks, James. And Fiona, I guess Herschel touched on some of those issues around how the pandemic has changed everybody's thinking about everything. I guess within the health sector, that's sort of front and center. I guess you've got a whole new set of concerns that you have to weave into your decarbonisation plans going forward. What does it look like from your perspective?
Yeah, so I think similar to Herschel, our estates are very similar. We've got very new, very old estate and a lot of buildings. We've got 1,100 plus hospital sites, 7,500 GPs. And you're right, the pandemic has had a huge impact on the NHS and the whole of society, in fact. It has not stopped us from focusing on net zero. If anything, I think it's accelerated it a little bit. In October last year, you might be aware that Health put out their delivering a net zero national health service strategy, and we're busily developing up sort of delivery plans to back that up. We're in the process of building, so we're building 40 new hospitals at the moment. They're all committed to be net zero, and we're actually launching a standard later on this year, which will set the sort of engineering standards for those net zero buildings. We know that we've got a long way to go and a lot to learn in the sector. I think that we've been sharing as much as we can across all of the departments and with the private sector. But I think the response to the pandemic shows, as James said, a lot of opportunities as well. We know that we need to digitalise our services, and this has showed us that we can do it at scale and at pace. I think the fact that we are doing this very webinar online, we would have probably come together in the past and be sat on a stage together. I think that's very good, but also it's good that we can take a step back and actually do events like this online, and that I think will continue into the future. And I think in health, clearly there are standards that we're going to have to look at. Ventilation is a huge thing. It's a huge thing for net zero. One of our biggest sort of impacts is in ventilation systems. And now we're looking at, well, do we need more mechanical ventilation? Can we use mixed mode? Can we use sort of passive ventilation? And I think the answer in all of that is probably we need a little bit more research on the back of this. This pandemic is still quite new, but I think it brings with it opportunities. People have seen a different way of life. People have seen the restoration of a lot of biodiversity in their own local areas. People have seen that working from home isn't that bad, but equally we need to build back that economic recovery, and we really need to focus in on how we build back industry, but build it back in a way that responds to net zero and ensures that we don't just go back to where we left off in sort of 2019-20.
Thanks, Fiona. I'd like to drill down a little bit. I mean, we talked about, I think all three of you talked about the existing asset base that you've got and how you bring that forward. I'd like to drill down into that, so I guess we can call the retrofit question. James, from your perspective, I mean, I imagine there are quite big challenges when it comes to improving the performance of existing buildings. How do you know how to go about procuring those services, how to measure your success? and also perhaps finding contractors with the right expertise. What's been your experience to date on that side of things, on the bringing existing assets up to a better performance standard?
Yeah, I think by and large we've got a really strong sort of construction supply chain at Highways England, as you might imagine. Sort of £27 billion worth of spend makes sort of our contracting partners work very much as a partnership rather than sort of by a contract basis. By and large, it's been a bit piecemeal at the moment. So it depends on the asset. So for our 24/7 buildings, clearly there are the obvious things that we would look to do, things like photovoltaics, building management systems, whereas we can be a little bit more innovative on things like depots and our offices, introducing sort of waste, no waste to landfill, wastewater recycling, making sure we use the benefits that COVID has brought in ways of working. So things like less photocopier, less sort of emails flying around the system. But it's really about, I think the challenge we are currently facing is to be genuinely looking at the embodied carbon in the estate and improving that. We have to be very specific about what goes into the materials that we build with. And the supply chain are great at looking at low carbon elements for building. But the problem we get is that the more prescriptive we get, the less innovation we have. So suppliers are given less chance to sort of come up with new ideas and put things forward. And I really worry that, every time we be so prescriptive about something, we lose the innovation. We know that, our own net zero plan is probably 85% planned out, and we know what's going to happen. But there's always an element as you get close to net zero where you've got 15% of stuff that actually we need that innovation and we need new things to happen and come into that space. So I think we've got a good rollout of things happening. We're greening up our motorway maintenance compounds. We're putting LEDs in our lights as standard now, but we really need to find that innovation. And I think my worry is, how do we take the supply chains with us? Because, as our sort of decarbonisation of transport plan unveiled by the Secretary of State last week showed, the criticism was more, it's too ambitious. And that's not going away. And hopefully Herschel and Fiona will agree that government is absolutely serious about pressing our targets further and faster, and greenwash won't do anymore. There's no sort of nice words. This needs to be actually delivered. And we, as a result, are going to be pushing our supply chains even harder. And we need partners that share those values. Greenwash will not be going forward. And how we encourage innovation is a really big key factor for me. And interesting to see how Herschel and Fiona sort of approach that as well, really.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the direction of travel from things like the construction playbook, just to stay with James for a second, that's talking about procuring on outcomes rather than being prescriptive, isn't it? So I guess that sort of aligns with that sort of direction from central government there as well.
Definitely, absolutely. But I think, as we all know, the devil's in the detail, and we very quickly fall back into value for money and things like that, and try and get more prescriptive almost by default. So I think we've got to sort of almost have a word with ourselves to let people be innovative and explore that space, and not be afraid of failure. Some things won't work, but that's okay, because it will get us a leap forward in what we do.
Thanks, James. Fiona, I imagine the challenge of retrofitting hospitals, which on the whole are fairly large buildings with lots of complexity behind them, must be a big challenge from your perspective.
Yeah, I think it is, yes. We have a vast amount of estate, and most of it will be the estate that we have in 2050, so most of it will need retrofitting. I think how we've tried to approach it, though, so there's just a bunch of stuff that you can do now. So there are things that are relatively easy, well-known, established. I almost feel a bit sad that we are having a conversation in 2021 where we're talking about putting LED lighting in any of our buildings, because they are proven, established, save money and carbon, and should just be there throughout our estate. And we're still having to make the case for that. Building management systems, heating and ventilation systems, there are things that are just standard that we know that we should do, and I think we need to accelerate that. I agree with James on the innovation point. I'll come back to that in just a sec. I think we really need to accelerate that. Then there's stuff that's a bit tougher. So cladding, and looking at all of the requirements for cladding, especially following some of the tragedies like Grenfell, that really brings into focus, you know, when we're looking at it, what it should be, what we can realistically use in our buildings, swapping out our heating systems for, you know, non-fossil fuel heating. We still have 2 coal boilers in the NHS. They're being removed at the moment. We still run on 6 of our sites on heavy duty fuel oil. You know, again, we're in 2021. And, you know, these are some of the realities of decarbonising your estate. And we're having to switch all of our hospitals' very large loads onto non-fossil fuel heating. And then solar, you know, do we really have the space for solar? Yes, we do have the space for some solar. Do we have enough? How do we use our land? And weigh that all up with the priorities of the health service, you know, recovering from COVID, reducing down the waiting lists, getting everybody back on track in terms of their health. So yeah, it's definitely a challenge, but I think something that our organisation is clearly up for. We are certainly, as a team, are up for it. And I think there's loads of things that people really want to do themselves, make a positive contribution to themselves. We certainly see that in some of the other areas, like plastic removal, sort of more of a moral imperative than necessarily a net zero, but definitely something people want to be involved in. And I agree with James, you know, even when we've done all of the modelling and we know what we know that we have a residual amount that we need to innovate out. We're shortly going to be taking on an innovation manager to look at the technical innovations in this space, because we think that that's something that we need to start planning for now for the future. The same with our overall workforce. We need to really upskill everybody in this language of what do we mean by net zero? What do we mean by climate emergency? What do we mean by health emergency? What is it that you can do in your job? So I think those things are really important, alongside, you know, the kind of nuts and bolts, if you like, of retrofitting buildings to net zero.
Thanks, Fiona. Herschel, I guess from across the education sector, there's such an enormous variety of different buildings of different standards, different vintages, etc. Again, I guess sort of there must be a variety of different approaches to how you try to bring those buildings up to modern standards.
Yeah, definitely, and I think it's not just types of buildings, but it's types of end users as well, which is really important to recognise. So we've got a devolved model in the school at the DFE, so we've got everything from local authority maintained schools through to multi-academy trusts, single academy trusts, and you know, I'm a governor at my daughter's school, and you can see the difference in the types of end users that you've got. And I think for me, what's really important as part of this journey is taking people on that journey, particularly non-technical people that aren't involved in construction. What is the why are we going to where we're going to? What does that mean for them? You know, for us to go around to schools and say, look, we're just going to take out all your gas boilers and put heat pumps in, even if we paid for it for free, is still a problem for schools because energy costs go up. So how do we take people on that journey to bring them on something really important, but also recognise that it's not just about throwing capital at something to get it to, you know, as James said, greenwashing it by throwing capital at things. I think it's really about taking people on that journey. We've also found through quite a lot of research that we think there's between 10 and 30% energy savings within the school estate just through good behaviour. So switching off lights, putting time controls on boilers, putting TRVs on radiators, and that's quick wins, and that's things that we can take people on the journey, quite easily take people on the journey with us. But it's how do you talk to 12 different types of people with a single message is the challenge really that we're facing. But I think that's really important. I think also, you know, innovation has been touched on. I think the last thing we should be doing, we have absolutely an opportunity, and the government's objective is to build back greener and better. You know, we should not be stifling innovation, whether that's procurement, whether that's technologies, whether that's contracts, supply chains, whatever it might be. We should be keeping that open to make sure that you know, we explore things. And as James and Fiona both touched on, it's okay to fail. I think we're in an era where testing things is okay, trialing it and coming back, sharing across governments. And you know, I've been in a number of discussions with NHS and MOJ, etc., around innovation. You know, sharing some of our failures has actually been part of the innovation journey for us, which is really important.
Thanks, Ash. I'd like to move on. I mean, we've had quite a bit of discussion there about innovation, the importance of it, and a lot of that, obviously, you can't dream that up yourselves. It's got to come from the supply chain that you work with, in many cases. James, what are you looking for from contractors? A lot of people viewing today's discussion may well come from that contractor background. Do they need to have their own house in order first? Is that the most important thing, that they have a good carbon strategy of their own, or is it more about what they can deliver for you? Where does the balance lie? Or probably both, I guess. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. It is definitely both. So, we are busily building a network that is going to have a lot of electric vehicles on it. We need to make journeys more reliable and more consistent as a result to get that sort of really green, zero energy vehicles and sort of transport system. But to enable that, we can't then have buildings which are a little bit dirty, and then we can't have a supply chain that is also, well, it's trying its best, but it's not really doing the job. So I think more and more supply chain partners will be audited, particularly for sort of procurement provenance on materials. One of the things we've struggled with looking at embodied carbon is, was that steel beam that was put there 20, 30 years ago, transported by boat, by air, by rail, and, one piece of steel that can look exactly the same as another has a very different carbon footprint. So it's more, we are going to be probably assuring what our supply chains are delivering to us. And we need, as I said on the previous point, really, we need somebody to share our values. It's a very genuine thing that, company values, particularly in the civil service, are very important. But having a supply chain partner that knows where you're coming from, that sees in project meetings that this is not just something I'm saying because it's a corporate line. This is absolutely through us like a stick of rock now, that, carbon, reducing our emissions and being more sustainable is absolutely the way we are going forward. It is probably the biggest thing on our agenda at Highways England. It's mentioned in more and more meetings, and everything is trickling through it. So I'm starting to see that business cases have a carbon section now. A surveyor in my team came forward with an idea to change buildings. Alongside the finance bit was also a carbon bit, and a carbon bit for each individual option. So our supply chain needs to be ready to sort of prove where materials have come from, prove that they're innovating and trying out new suppliers, and sort of working with us on, there are certain schemes and buildings, particularly our 24/7 operations, where we probably don't want to fail, but there are an awful lot of buildings where we can go the extra mile, and it is not massively critical if something fails first time, but if it works, then we can sort of retrofit it into other buildings. So again, it's work with us. We've got a lot of estate between all three of us, really, where we can try things out. We can be that pilot environment for our contractors. We've got space at the moment where we're trialing different things for our network. I want to be able to offer our sort of portfolio to the contracting departments to say, look, work with us, try it out, see if it works. If it doesn't, we roll on, we move forward. So I think we can offer them an estate to play with, but by the same token, we need the innovation funneled through and really adopting our key values as their own almost, which I know is difficult, but we need to push forward on that idea as much as we can, really.
And just to stay with you for a second, James, is there enough sort of trust in the network? Is there enough standardization in the network to be able to look at the carbon claims of a supplier and trust them? Construction News had a look at some of the carbon claims by top contractors last year, and they were using various different standards, some of them audited and some of them not, some of them voluntary, etc. I mean, is that a problem, trying to weigh up apples against oranges?
It definitely is, yes. I think we've suffered from that from ourselves, as Fiona's touched on earlier. I think we are also going through a training plan with all our people to explain, what one phrase means against another, and you can hear it in different contexts. It means different things. So there needs to be a standardization of language amongst all this. I think the beauty of the public sector is we publish everything up front. We're very transparent, and it's for our supply chain to look at those documents and see how we refer to them, and then I think adapt their approach, because we can sort out the details between us when it comes to business cases or investments to make sure that all the language is aligned from our point of view. But as a start point, all our sort of documents, our net zero documents, our corporate carbon strategies, they are fully public and open documents that supply chain can get hold of, look at before any tenders or anything like that is looked at. So I think more and more it's the relationship to work with each other before the tender comes through that we're looking at. And, you know, that's not just one supplier, that could be a range. And we need to sort of be a lot more open in how we jointly approach the problem of carbon. But if we have a contractor who is not performing, who is blatantly, you know, using greenwash techniques, then we probably aren't going to be using them, and they're not going to be winning the tenders of the future, because carbon is going to be a big part of procurement, the business case, and the investment is going to affect every single aspect of it. Thanks,
James. Fiona, same sort of question to you, really. What are you looking for in a good contractor when it comes to that sort of carbon reputation, that what they can do for you, and how you assess their capabilities and their own journey to becoming a cleaner supplier?
Sure. So I don't want to take away from some stuff that's coming out later this year, but we are going to have, we've done a lot of active engagement, and I'm sure that some of the suppliers on the call will have been part of that. With our supply chain, we're actually putting out a framework for what we're expecting from our suppliers over the next 10 years, and the people that we'll do business with and be happy to do business with. So I think that will become, that standardization we're almost driving some of that, and I think as a public sector we'll probably continue to drive some of that. But equally, you know, people need time and certainty. I think that the supply chain need time and certainty to know that this is a long-term thing, and I think that the confidence in that will hopefully be shown by all of the organisations, and has been shown by the government framework of net zero, I think. And I think the way that we are doing things is different. So we've been working with EcoQuip recently, which is a EU-funded scheme, to put out a couple of innovation tenders. So we're saying to the supply chain, hey guys, we've got a problem. Can you help us fix it? And we've had some super ideas coming through. And I think that as a public sector organisation, we will start to do that more and more. Where we don't know what the solution is, we really need the expertise, the innovation that is driven in the private sector and our supply chain to come forward and say, do you know what? Yeah, you've got this problem, we've got a solution, or we've got 5 solutions, or 5 people have got 5 different solutions. At least then we know about those things, and then we can start to test them and sort of put them into motion. We'll start. We've got a plan to start some living lab type sites, so people testing technologies, testing innovations, really seeing if they work, but obviously making sure for us patient safety is front and centre, number one. We would never do anything that would harm that. So I think that, you know, in that context, it's really exciting to see the supply chain stepping up and coming back and saying, yep, don't worry, we've got a solution for that. And also where they don't, to sort of see things that are almost in their incubator stage. You know, they're just an idea, but we can help to move that forward. And hopefully, you know, across all of the government departments, we're trying to work a lot more closely together across health, education, justice and defence to try and solidify all of those things. And I think you're right, the playbook will start to set some of those framework standards, and I think as sort of individual departments we will start to drive forward in our own context those standards a lot more, especially through our procurements.
Thanks, Fiona. Herschel, what's your perspective from your side of things? What does a good contractor look like, and what are you hoping to get from them?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, because we've obviously got a very large supply chain with lots and lots of contractors on it. I think we've just undergone circa 24 pilot schemes for net zero carbon sustainable schools with various contractors on them. And I think the biggest thing that's come out of it is collaboration. So open and transparent sort of relationships between both parties around you know, what they're learning, what they're sharing with us, what they're sharing with their sort of competitors, as it were, across that supply chain has been a really important part of the sort of journey, you know, defining how we want that relationship to be going forward. But I think it's really important, and as James was sort of saying earlier, that it's really important that, you know, that transparency, but also things around wording and the way that we describe things is really fundamental to creating that long-term, really good relationships, because it's very, very clear that people can get confused between various terminologies and end up creating very different sort of thinking around things. But yeah, so the big one for me is probably collaboration. We've witnessed it. It's been fantastic for our supply chain on our pilot. I think the second thing is standardization, and Fiona's touched on that before. And the whole concept of MMC and DFMA is really, really important to us. So that ability, not just from a four walls and a roof perspective, what is that standardization, but also processes and systems. We don't want to be reinventing things all the time. We don't want to be redesigning, I don't know, lighting calculations for the same standard room every time. We want to be putting that money and investing it in the right parts of the building to maximize that. And actually, through our supply chain and contractors, we want to be able to work with them for them to be honest and transparent around, look, standardization has helped us save this, and this is what we can offer back on these schemes as part of that process. It's a really important part for us, I think.
Fiona touched on how well different parts of the public sector may be collaborating with each other and sharing lessons and things like that. Is that something that you see from your perspective, Herschel? When you talked about collaborating, I think you were talking about collaborating with your supply chain, but are you witnessing collaboration across different departments and things?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Fiona and I probably are at a meeting every now and again. We haven't been in a meeting together for a while, but certainly been in touch with the likes of Bays and some of the policies coming out from their side and how we can either support them or they can support us on our policy decision making. DEFRA, doing a lot of work with them around sort of natural capital and how we can quantify things like increasing biodiversity or adding green infrastructure to sites rather than lots and lots of tarmac for parking. What does that mean? How do we quantify those things? And even likes of Ministry of Defence and Justice as well. We aren't that dissimilar. When you look at a building, it is. I know the sort of details are very, very different, but at the end of the day, there's still four walls and a roof. So that collaboration between departments is fundamental. We're absolutely doing a lot of it and lots of knowledge sharing at the moment between us.
Well, that's great to hear. Very encouraging. Fiona, from your perspective, to make progress and the progress that you need to make, are you getting enough of a steer from central government? Obviously, there are overarching targets for the nation to achieve net zero targets by 2050 and things like that. Is it clear enough about how you're expected to fit in with that? Is there enough information and guidance from central government?
Yeah, great question. And I think, yes, there is. So I think the government have been very clear about their direction of travel, from the Paris Agreement to the Climate Change Act to adopting zero carbon targets, being the first major economy to sign up to net zero by 2050. I think all of that framework really sets the direction of travel. I think in health, I'm incredibly proud of how we've made the links between climate and health. And I know that that's something that all of our organisations need to do. In education, it's really important. You've got young people on school strikes, and, I'm sure that Herschel feels that now more than ever. We've got doctors who are sort of striking against climate change and speaking out and saying that they really want to the organisations to do something about that. And I think that it's just taken a while for our organisations to have a look at net zero and climate change and really align it with our business objectives. So we're here to promote and protect people's health. And I think that that's the link that was potentially missing previously, is how we prioritise net zero along with all of the other priorities within the NHS. And obviously the recovery from COVID is going to be one that we have to really respond to, as the rest of the nation does as well. But how we do that in a way that promotes and accelerates the drive to net zero. And I think that what's happened in society has definitely brought it to the fore. We've had a lot of people being very vocal about it, and I think that that's really, really helped. Our staff in the hospitals, we've got doctors shouting out saying, we want something done about this. And that almost gives us the mandate to accelerate. But I think the government's framework's being clear. Of course, this stuff's going to evolve. I mean, James talked about embodied carbon earlier. We're at the real beginning, and I always say to the team, whatever we put in place now, in 10 years, we'll look back and think, God, that was a bit basic, wasn't it? But we are putting something in place, and I think that's the whole thing. We are all moving on it. We're all trying. We're all sharing. We're all learning, and the quicker we can do that, and almost, the quicker we can accelerate and learn, that will really drive progress. And I think that's what's really going to set the sort of standard for the UK being one of the leaders in delivering this, for sure.
Thanks, Fiona. James, from your perspective, I guess one of the things you desperately need from government is enough money to achieve the things that you need to achieve. Is that a big problem in driving forward your carbon decarbonisation plans, having the sufficient budget, having sufficient elbow room to get the things done that you need to get done?
Yeah, money is always a challenge, especially when you're trying to deliver infrastructure and go sort of more and more innovation in the infrastructure delivering to make sure it's not only fit for the current sort of ways of the vehicles, but also for the sort of autonomous vehicles that are definitely coming down the line, as well as the sort of new signalling systems, etc. So money is a big part of it. Our sort of structure at the moment is really positive in that we're a sort of company. So we get a 5-year funding settlement, which allows us to really plan for the future. We have inbuilt efficiency targets within that funding. And it's a bit like what Fiona said just a few moments ago, really. It's not so much as we are held back and can't possibly do any green or carbon initiative without the money. It's more that we are using the carbon arguments and the really strong steer that we are getting from government to really sort of tailor what are our schemes going to look like in the future, what's our estate going to look like. There's an uncomfortable truth that I think, when I always talk to my team about it at Highways, we're on about the second week of January in a sort of year-long event in carbon terms. So, we picked the low-hanging fruit. We've done that. It's a bit like the diet after the new year. And now it's the hard yards. It's the hard messages. It's the bit that we have got to stop doing certain things. We will need to operate from less space. We can't just assume that we're going to green our way out of it. We need physically less space. We need to work in much more different ways. We need to invest in our buildings and be really vocal about that and really communicate it well, because every time we've done even a small investment in a local lighting system, for example, in an office, we've found that people's behaviours change because they see that if the company's investing in this, they must be serious. If it's a sort of wastewater system, then I'll turn the tap off instead of leaving it running. And that has huge impacts. The behaviours really do sort of amplify that investment case that you perhaps don't see at a business case level. So for us, of course, more money, you can do more things more quickly, but it is not going to stop the trajectory we're on. We have still got our net zero plan, we've got our corporate carbon plans, and they are not sort of dependent on vast sums of money coming in extra. It is absolutely for us to innovate in that space and deliver what we can on the carbon and what we stated we will do within our current funding envelopes.
Thanks, James. Herschel, I could see you nodding along to various points there. From your perspective, I guess it's going to be a similar difficult picture about making sure that you have funds in the right place.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't think it's any secret that there isn't going to be huge amounts of money given where we are. We've just come out of I don't know whether we're in it or coming out of it, but we're somewhere in a pandemic, and it's. I think what it's for the DFE, what it's made us do, it's made us sit down and really think about where are the right places to invest money. This isn't just again about throwing lots and lots of money at things. Yes, it helps, of course it will help, but actually being really sort of streamlined and strategic around how we spend that money and where we put that money. There's lots of funding we already get, particularly around condition need and for our school estate. So how do we best spend that money? What's the best way of doing that? So not only are we addressing things like condition, but we're also adding layers of sustainability or climate change on top of it. I'm not sure that, like I said, money will help, but it's given us an opportunity to really set out our strategy for the long term. And I think it's worth adding as well, your first question to Fiona around government have really set that target, that 2050 target and the 6th carbon budget. And I think it's really important that, it's for departments to figure out how to do this now, because we do have to, that's where we differ as departments. We have different objectives, different outcomes that we need to achieve. Setting our net zero strategy, ours will look different to health because we have different objectives, because we have different outcomes that we need to achieve. But we're not relying on government to tell us what to do. We'll come up with the how. They'll tell us when we need to do it by.
One of the reasons, Herschel, I was thinking about that funding is we talked about innovation, we talked about new technologies, and sometimes you have to change the way that you're delivering things in order to get if you want a step change in outcomes, you need a step change in input sometimes. And it's that ability to innovate. I mean, is that a particular challenge for you to be able to feel the confidence and freedom to try different things?
I mean, I think it's given us as a department a lot more confidence to try new things. I mean, just to give you an example, boilers are our biggest issue in the schools, as I'm sure it's for many built environment government properties, but boilers and roofs. But we're replacing boilers one at a time. For example, each responsible body is responsible for replacing their boilers. Now we're looking at solutions of how can we batch that up? How can we create economies of scale here? How can we use I think we're calling them energy pods now, create low carbon energy pods and deliver them to site. So it's given us a huge opportunity to say, well, actually, this can save time, money, disruption, all using innovation for, all for less money. So it absolutely has given us that ability to think more laterally around how to be more creative in spending money.
Thanks, Herschel. Fiona, I'm going to come back to you for the next question. Obviously, climate change is not just about decarbonisation, it's about making sure that your assets are resilient. We know that there's going to be more extreme weather events, there's going to be more overheating and things like that. Where does that sit in your thinking and your plans? Is that a major concern for you?
Yeah, I mean, climate change adaptation is a huge part of our plans. Clearly, we've got hospitals that sit in floodplains. We've done some assessment around that, and we need to look. Most of our critical plant sits in basements or on roofs, so they're either going to be flooded or too hot. And we already track and log the overheating events every summer, and they are increasing, unsurprisingly. I think that they are two areas where the world is very aware and people are very aware. I think more and more it's affecting our lives. You only have to look back in the news in the last couple of weeks, what's happening in Germany, what happened in the States and in Canada. These things are kind of more regular. And if you think back just to pre-pandemic, at the beginning of 2020, the Australian fires were, we thought, going to be the defining sort of thing of 2020. The pandemic itself has sort of shown that we need to adapt. And I think that certainly with us, and even with our net zero strategies, we have got biodiversity in there. Obviously, that can deal with some of the impacts of resilience impacts from things like flooding and overheating. But we have very much said climate change adaptation is in there. That is something that we're focusing on, and making our estate resilient, making sure people can access healthcare. And I'm sure it's the same for Herschel in education, making sure people can access education, and for James, making sure that the roads aren't melting, and people can access through flooded roads. It's a challenge for all of us, and I think that's something that we are all, I don't want to speak on behalf of the other guys, but something that we're all looking at, because it is really, really important for our business resilience.
Well, thank you very much, Fiona. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for now. All that remains for me to say is to Fiona, to James, to Herschel, thank you very much for participating in this panel and sharing your opinions so openly. It's been very interesting from my perspective. I'm sure it is for our delegates as well. Now, I believe the next thing we have on our schedule is a break. So enjoy the break. We'll see you again later this afternoon.